Good morning to you in Canada. Good afternoon in Europe. Welcome to this webinar session on public procurement opportunities in Canada, a training session for European companies. On behalf of the delegation of the European Union to Canada, it's my great pleasure to welcome you in large numbers to this session. I will give the floor in a minute to Maud Labatte, who is the first Counselor of the Trade and Economy section at the delegation of the EU to Canada. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started, and then Maud will introduce our two speakers. So the session today there will be a presentation that will last for about an hour. This will include some time and moments for Q&A. Our speakers will give you more details with regards to how we're going to proceed. As I'm sure most of you are familiar now with those virtual settings and Zoom settings, you will be able to use the chat box or the Q&A function to type in your questions, and we will read them out loud. After the presentation, we will also have some more time for interaction. We will have two breakout rooms, one with each of the two speakers. So all the questions that you're going to have that will not be answered during the presentation, you will be able to join one of the two rooms, and then this will be a more informal setup for you to ask all your questions to our speakers. And so we'll have some more time there. So without further ado, I will now pass the screen or the floor to Maud Labatte. I hope you enjoyed this webinar session, and I look forward to your questions. Maud, over to you.
Thank you, Antoine, and good morning and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Maud Labatte. I'm the Trade Counsellor at the delegation of the European Union to Canada. My role at the delegation is mainly to work on the implementation of the free trade agreement that has been in place between the European Union and Canada since 2017, called the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or in short, CETA. So I'm delighted to be here today with you, and I hope you will learn a lot. CETA has opened new opportunities for European companies who want to bid on Canadian procurement at all levels of government. Now, this does not mean, of course, that European companies know where to find information about open tenders, what are the local practices, or even whether they're entitled to bid. So in order to help European companies navigate through their new rights, the delegation of the European Union to Canada has developed a number of resources for European interested companies. First, we have developed two guides, a general one that explains the principles of CETA when it comes to procurement, and then a more practical one that focuses on where to find information in each province. And today, as a third step, we're organizing this practical training on procurement, which will go into more detail than the guides, but more importantly, which will allow you to ask questions directly to our two experts, as Antoine mentioned. Joining us today, we have Liz Busch and Jerry Stobo. Both bring a wealth of experience to this webinar. Liz has over 20 years experience in the field of procurement with a specific focus on provincial procurement. In her position, she has authored in particular British Columbia's Practical Guide on Procurement Practices, and she now provides procurement services and advice to clients in both the public and the private sector. Turning to Jerry, Jerry is a leading authority in public procurement in Canada. He has been General Counsel at the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, Canada's federal bid challenge authority, and he was the leader of the Public Procurement Practice Group in Canada's largest law firm. He's very familiar with the CETA, and he has represented European companies who have participated in federal and sub-federal procurements in Canada. Now, with this introduction, I would like to turn it over to you, Liz and Jerry. Thank you very much, and enjoy this webinar.
Thank you so much, Maud. So welcome to everybody who is joining us. I'm going to be starting our presentation off with a bit of a discussion about how we have organized our presentation. So as you know, we're going to be doing this presentation, and then afterwards we'll be doing our two breakout rooms, and we'll give you more information a little later on as to how you get into those breakout rooms once we finish with the presentation. So in our presentation, we have a few things we want to talk about. The first is we're going to take a virtual trip across Canada based on the survey results that we got. I understand that there's quite a few of you there who are joining us today that may not have ever been to Canada, may not know a whole lot about it. So we're going to take a little bit of time and take you across the country and talk about a little bit about Canada and also who has authority, responsibility for procurement across the country. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time around the Canadian procurement governance. And governance is going to be looking at things like applicable legislation, case law policies at the federal as well as the provincial territorial levels. Then we'll be moving on to discuss trade agreements. We are going to be mentioning a number of them. But the focus of this presentation is going to be on the CETA. Types of opportunities in Canada is going to focus on the various types of opportunities for you to submit information or to compete for contracts that you may see in Canada. So what are they? What do they mean? We're going to talk a bit about the major ones. We'll get to unfair procurement practices, and this will focus on what may be seen as unfair, what may be actually unfair, and then some informal processes that you can take if you've been involved in a solicitation that in some way you feel was not done as it should have been. Then we'll be moving on to the bid challenge recourse, and this would be the focus will be more on the formal remedies that would be available to you if you think that the decision was an inappropriate one. Now, to keep this interesting and keep folks engaged, we do have a few whiteboard exercises and some polls as we go on until we get to the end of our presentation, and then we'll go into our breakout discussions at the end. So before we get started in all of this, I wanted to talk a little bit about questions. Antoine mentioned that we will be using the chat box for any questions that you may have as we go. What will happen is that this slide that you're seeing right now, this is our slide to pause and to take a look at the chat box to see if there are any questions that we can answer. So we're not going to answer as we go, but we'll wait till we get to one of these slides, and then we'll stop, we'll read what's in the comment section and answer all the questions that we can. Now, a bit of a word on questions, though. Jerry and I are going to do our best to answer all of the questions that we can today, but keep in mind that often the answer depends on the specific circumstances. So something that can be just a slight difference can actually make a big difference in terms of what the answer to that question would be. So just keep that in mind. If we start running short of time, we'll let you know that, and we'll say, please hold your questions, and if we can get to them later in the presentation, we will. If not, remember, we do have the breakout sessions, and that'll be another opportunity to answer any questions that you may have. And one final caution, remember that Jerry and I are not providing anybody with any legal advice in this presentation or in the breakout rooms afterwards. We're providing you answers to your questions and information based on our expertise. But if you need to rely on anything that we say during this session, either in the presentation or the breakout rooms, if you need to rely on that in a legal matter, we strongly recommend that you consult with your own lawyer and just make sure that what we've told you, how you've interpreted, actually fits and works for your specific circumstances. So with that, before we actually jump into our first agenda item, is there any questions, anything that somebody wants to ask before we get started? I'm not seeing anything so far in the chat. Okay, perfect. Let's move on then. And we're going to start with one of our whiteboard exercises. And this is just a quick thing to start everybody thinking about getting your thoughts on doing business in Canada. So we have this whiteboard here, and what I'd like you to do is to write on the whiteboard what your thoughts are on doing business with Canada, whether you've ever done it before or not, just what it is that you've heard, what it is that you think might apply or that you might be worried about. In order to write on the whiteboard, what you want to do is you've got a little green box, and you click on that, and you're going to see one of your options will be annotate. If you don't see annotate, just click on the 3 dots that say more, and then annotate would be one of your options. And then with annotate, you would when you click on that, you'll see some various options come up. You want to take the one that says text, and then you can click anywhere on the board, and you can start typing in. So anything that you like. So for example, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to click on the text, what do I think about doing business in Canada? So maybe for me, if I've never been here before, there's a lot of unknowns. Okay? So that might be something like there's a lot of things I just don't know about Canada. So feel free to type in your thing, anything that you like. I do believe everybody should be able to type in, although I'm not seeing anything. No, it looks like everybody can. So please feel free to jump in there. And for my panel members as well, if there's something that you guys would like to type in there, just anything that you like. Boy, we're having folks little difficulties getting started here today. This sometimes happens, I'm afraid. Here we go, friendliness. That's awesome. Yes, Canada has a reputation of being very friendly and very polite. Although I must say, a couple of years ago, I did go to Bali, and Bali was very polite, friendly people. It was even for someone from Canada. Any other thoughts on what it might be like to do business in Canada, or what you may think about Canada? Any other thoughts on this one? Oh, we're going to have fun getting folks started in all of this. There we go. Many jurisdictions. That's another great thought. The jurisdictions that we have within Canada, and we're going to be talking about that as we go through our virtual trip in terms of how big Canada is and how it's divided up. All right. Okay, so how about if we move on from this one then? I'm just going to clear everything and let's move on to our next section here. Get rid of this and here we go. All right. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take our trip across Canada, and we're going to be looking at the 3 levels of government that Canada has. So we'll be looking at it from a federal position, excuse me, the provinces and territories, as well as municipal governments as well. All right, and we're going to start then with Canada as a whole. So Canada is a very large country when you think of it in terms of geography. So in geography, we're just shy of 10 million square kilometers with a population of just under 38 million people. And what's interesting is most of the people in Canada live within about 160 kilometers of the southern border. And that means that there are vast, vast tracts of land in Canada with very, very few people actually living in them. So along the southern border, we have cities that many of our cities have millions of people. And when you start heading north, fewer and fewer per kilometer. Canada has 2 official languages, French and English, although predominantly every section of Canada will predominantly speak one or the other. For example, Quebec is predominantly French, where I am in British Columbia, predominantly English. There are a lot of Canadians as well that have another language as their first language. So they've either immigrated to Canada or their family has in the past. So their first language may be something other than English or French. Another common perception of Canada is that it's cold and snowy here all the time. If you are for those of you who have never been here before, just to dispel that, except for the far north, actually, Canada does have something other than winter as our seasons. A lot of places in Canada, the snow starts falling late October, sometime in November. It's gone by April-ish. That's fairly typical for most of the country, except for the far north. For myself in British Columbia, I actually live in the very southern tip of the Vancouver Island. And where I'm at, we actually maybe get a couple of weeks of snow a year, and sometimes not even that. So we're not completely snowbound all of the time. All right. So let's talk then about the Canadian federal government. So for procurement, the federal government's office that is responsible is Public Services and Procurement Canada. It's also known as Public Works and Government Services. So they go by the two names. They have offices right across Canada, but they are headquartered in the capital, which is in Ottawa, Ontario. The federal government buys every kind of goods and services, everything from aircrafts to paper clips, training services to scientific research, and they also do construction projects. So there's an incredibly wide variety of things that they will buy. So the Public Services and Procurement Canada, they serve the federal departments and agencies as their central purchasing agents. And they also manage, they have real property manager, the treasurer, accountant, pay and pension administrator, et cetera. It's headed by a minister and the receiver general for Canada. And they do divide their procurement into three very distinct areas, which I've outlined here. So anything to do with defense and marine, they have a department that manages all of that. Anything to do with real property, so we're talking about property that the federal government may purchase or renovate or lease. They have a department for that. And then everything else, they have just a simple the procurement department that deals with anything that doesn't fall into those other two buckets. They spend about $22 billion a year in procurement. So it's a fairly significant spend, I think, for the federal government. We're now going to take a look at our provincial and territorial governments, and we're going to start at the very eastern tip of Canada and move our way west. And we'll start then with the Atlantic provinces. There are four, and we'll start with Newfoundland and Labrador. And they have the Newfoundland and Labrador Public Procurement Agency. And this one, they are responsible for managing the procurement process on behalf of the government departments within the province. Now, they actually didn't define how much they spend on an annual basis, but it's probably comparable with what other Atlantic provinces do based on their population. So their population is about 522,000 people, which is about half of what Nova Scotia is. And we'll be talking about Nova Scotia in just a moment. So that's Newfoundland and Labrador. And then we're at Nova Scotia, the next province, and they have Service Nova Scotia and Internal Services Procurement. They spend about $2 billion on goods. So they have a population of just under 1,967,000. They spend about $2 billion, which is why I was thinking Newfoundland and Labrador probably spend in the neighborhood of about $1 billion in a year. And this is for all their goods, services, and construction. They actually are the most populous of the Atlantic provinces, so they probably have the highest spend of the four Atlantic provinces. So they guide agencies, boards, and commissions, as well as the greater public sector. So that would include things like the municipalities, academic institutions, et cetera. So they support all of these public sector organizations. And they also provide outreach and education to their supplier community. So that's something that may be of interest to you if you're looking for opportunities within Nova Scotia. And they have sustainable procurement education to their internal client departments, as well as those in what's called the MASH sector. So that would be the municipalities, academia, so think like post-secondary institutions, social services, and health. That's what's called the MASH sector. Okay. Next, we're going to head to Prince Edward Island. In terms of landmass, PEI is the smallest of the provinces, and it has a population of about 157,000 people. They spend about $100 million a year on goods and services, and they do so through their PEI procurement services, who buys everything on behalf of the province except for what goes through health PEI. So anything related to health would go through health PEI. We go to New Brunswick now. This is the last of the Atlantic provinces, and New Brunswick has Service New Brunswick Strategic Procurement, and they also have transportation and infrastructure. They manage the construction projects. So they've hived off construction, and everything else is done through Service New Brunswick. Now, the population of New Brunswick is about 776,000. And they spend about $1 billion a year in goods and services. 729 million is goods and services, 294 is construction. So it gives you an idea of the split for what they do. Next province we're going to talk about is Quebec. It's the second most populated province in Canada. There's about 8.5 million people who are living in Quebec. Now, I am not a French speaker, so I'm not sure I want to try and pronounce this in French, but the Treasury Board Secretariat, they are the people who are responsible for procurement in Quebec. They propose legislative and regulatory texts. They do the policies and directives regarding contracts, and they also specific for goods and construction and services. They provide consultancy for the practices of goods procurement and the performance of construction works and services. And what that means is that they support the various departments within Quebec that actually do the buying themselves. Okay? And they do take part in negotiation and follow-up of agreements as well. So just to keep in mind that procurement in Quebec includes a mandatory registration for contracts that are above $5 million Canadian, which means that if you saw an opportunity in Quebec that was of interest to you and it did hit that dollar threshold, that's just an extra step you would have to do, is to register as a vendor so that you would be able to participate in that particular solicitation. We'll go to Ontario. It's the most populated province in Canada. There's about 14.5 million people who live in Ontario. They spend about 29 billion on goods and services, and this ranges from things like pacemakers and bandages to computers and IT hardware. So again, a really broad spectrum, goods, services, and construction that they buy. Supply Chain Ontario is a centralized procurement agency that works across the Ontario public service and their broader public sector. And this was formed with the intention of streamlining processes and increasing its buying power. So they have more of a centralized model than a lot of other provinces may have. And as you can see, the province of Ontario their spend in a year is fairly comparable with what the federal government is spending. Manitoba is next. This is the first of our Western provinces, and it has a population of about 1.4 million people. They spend about 29 million on construction and about 2.1 on consulting contracts, and another 71.5 million on products and services. And they also have a centralized procurement shop. This would be a procurement services branch. And they also hive off anything to do with accommodations or real property is managed through their accommodation services. Next, we are going to go to Saskatchewan. They have a population of about 1.2 million people. They actually recently launched a new structure on how they do procurement within Saskatchewan, and it's called Sask Builds. And this was launched just in 2019, so it's been very, very recently done. In their first year, Sask Builds posted opportunities worth about $500 million. I would expect that their actual spend throughout a full fiscal year, is probably quite a bit higher than that, but it does give you an idea of what Sask Builds is doing. And the way that works is that if there is a project that is valued under $5 million Canadian, the buyer, the buying entity, they can either do it on their own or they have the option of bringing Sask Builds in to help them with it. But anything over 5 million, Sask Builds has to be involved. That's a policy that they've built up. The next Western province is Alberta. They have a population of about 4.5 million people. They spend about 575 million on goods and 1.7 billion on services, and another 2.5 billion on construction. So it's a fair spend on their part. Service Alberta manages their goods acquisitions over a certain threshold. But Alberta is decentralized, so the ministries within the Alberta government, they manage their own acquisitions for goods under the threshold, and then anything to do with construction, that would be managed through infrastructure and transportation. Okay. Then we're going to get into the last of the Western provinces, which is British Columbia. We have in BC, which is where I'm located, we have a population of just over 5 million altogether. And the BC government spends just shy of $7 billion per year on goods, services, and construction. For the ministries, they have, in BC, we're quite decentralized, but it's set up where purchases of goods over a certain threshold must go through procurement services. And for services, the ministries have the option of either doing it themselves or going through procurement services, up to them. Construction is different, though. Construction has been divided up into specific pockets within government that's responsible for construction. So, for example, the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, they would be responsible for roads and things. Ministry of Forests may have, they would also have roads. We for things that are within the lands that they manage. Anything to do with buildings would go through Real Property Division and Ministry of Citizen Services. So construction, I've given you a link here that explains that in a bit more detail, but keep in mind it is very decentralized across BC. So we're going to move now north to the territories. We're going to start with the Yukon. The Yukon Territory has just over 41,000 people. So now we're getting into the farther northern parts of Canada, which is why that it's a lot less people, a big landmass, but a lot less people. So 41,000 people, they spend about $345 million a year on goods, services, and construction. And they are also decentralized, where each government department is responsible for their own procurement policies. Northwest Territories is next. It has a population of about 45,000 people. It spends $260 million a year on its goods, services, and construction. They do have the procurement shared services, and they provide information on training on how to do business with the government of the Northwest Territories. They distribute the public procurements on behalf of their client departments, etc. So there's some good information if you're interested in doing work with the Northwest Territories. Nunavut is our final stop. It has a population of just over 39,000. They spend about $174 million in fuel, $43 million in police and laboratory services, and another $550 million on goods, services, and construction each year. And they have their procurement, logistics, and contract support. They are the central contract authority for the government, which is part of their Ministry of Finance. All right. And then we'll just briefly talk about municipalities. There are quite a range of local governments, municipal governments in Canada, everything from the really large cities. So you're talking like City of Toronto, for example, has almost 6 million people in it. Montreal has almost 4 million, right down to the really small towns and districts and everything in between. What you'll find with municipal governments is typically the larger municipalities, local governments, have their own procurement departments. They may use the provincial, for example, they're posting platforms for advertising their opportunities, but they tend to manage them themselves. A small municipality might not have a separate procurement department. Oftentimes they have people who are part of their elected council that wear lots of hats. I've even heard of some small towns where the procurement manager drives a school bus. So they have quite a wide range of how they've structured themselves for the municipalities. So we're going to do a quick poll. Let's make sure everybody's still awake on this one. And on this poll, we're just going to give a moment here to have it come up. If we can get the poll up here. I'm not seeing it come up. There we go. Excellent. So for this one, sorry, this is the wrong poll. We've got to go to, can we go to the first poll? Sorry, we're still on the wrong poll. Here we go. There we go. So now that we've kind of gone through that virtual trip across Canada, I'm just curious if you would click on the place that you would like to visit most, where after you've seen this, and maybe based on things that you've heard yourself about Canada, what are the places that you think you'd like to visit most of this? I'm just gonna give everybody a few more moments here just to put your answers in. I'm kind of keeping track of how many people we got online and how many of you are voting. Interesting. I'm going to show you the results here in a moment. I just want to give everybody a chance to be able to vote before I end this. Okay, give you a couple more seconds here. You get your last of the votes in. All righty, so I'm going to end the polling and I'm going to share the results with everybody. And you know, it's almost evenly distributed. I find this really fascinating. So a lot of folks are interested in visiting Quebec and Ontario, which does not surprise me in the least, being that these are they've got the largest spend, they've got the largest population, they have some of our biggest cities. Yeah, so Ontario and Quebec, that's almost 70% of you are in that neighborhood. A little more than 70% are interested in that. Western Canada, there's a good interest in that. Western Canada, in terms of geography, is quite diverse. You've got everything from prairies to mountains, so that's kind of cool. We've got 28% of folks interested in the territories, so going up north, I'm sure would be just beautiful. I've been to Yukon myself. I haven't been to all of the territories yet. And then another 23% in the Atlantic provinces, which is the Atlantic provinces actually has some of the oldest cities and things to see there. It's just quite amazing. Excellent. All right, let's move on then to our next. Oops, let's see. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay, so a little bit of information on the single point of access. For those of you that are familiar with the trade agreement, the CETA, you know that one of the obligations within CETA is that the members have to have a single point of access for the vendors who are interested in doing business. So as a European vendor, if you're interested in doing business in Canada, there is an obligation with the trade agreement that we're going to have one website that you can go to find opportunities within Canada. Now, they have the agreement gave a period of time before this needed to be in place, because I can tell you that right now this is not something that we have. But the federal government is working on this. So at the moment, if you've ever seen Opportunities for Canada, you would see it on Buy and Sell. That is the website that the federal government uses. It does connect to the websites, some of the websites that the provinces use, but they are actually in the process of building a new site called Canada Buys, and that's the site that is going to have that built-in single point of access. Now, I'm not certain myself how exactly that's going to work, and like, will it be that you can do one search and it'll grab things from all of the sites that across the provinces? I'm not sure how all that's going to work, but I'm really looking forward to this going live. And my understanding of what the federal government is doing is that they're not quite ready to launch, although I think it's close. And for a period of time, they're going to have both sites working simultaneously before they shut down the Buy and Sell and exclusively go to Canada Buys. So, and just as a bit more information on this, both of these sites have require you to be registered in order to view and participate in the solicitations that they have posted. So just to be aware that would be an extra step. There's not a cost or anything to it, but you would need to register yourself as a vendor in order to submit your responses to any solicitations on these sites. Now, another thing that's going to be of interest, I think, to a lot of people here is so where are these sites now, especially since we don't have that single point of access? How do I find these sites where the provinces are posting their opportunities? So Antoine was speaking in early, when we first kicked things off, about the guidance that has been developed for you under CETA. And that's what this link is to the document that has been developed. These particular page numbers will be helpful for you to find the links to the specific sites for the provinces that are of interest for you to go and look things up. And with that, we're going to pause. Do we have any questions? Anything that folks want to have on here?
We do have a general question from Christian on some of the main general challenges that European companies encounter when conducting business in Canada. Do you want to save this one for later, maybe after you say a few more about the presentation, or do you want to address this now? It's up to you.
Yeah. I'll say a couple of things, and it might raise more questions later on this. I do believe that in terms of the challenges for a European company looking at a specific opportunity in Canada, one is that there's not just one way to manage a solicitation in Canada. A lot depends on who is it that has issued this solicitation. So you're not necessarily able to say, okay, I've applied to something in Manitoba and it works this way. Now I see something in New Brunswick that is similar. I'll just respond in the same way. It doesn't necessarily work that way because it does depend on who's managing that particular solicitation. That's one of the biggest challenges that I would find. Jerry, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Liz. And this is an issue that I regularly see when I'm representing bidders, suppliers from foreign countries. And there is often a lot of confusion about the terms and conditions that are imposed in the RFP, or in the procurement processes, which differ from typical procurement processes either in Europe or in the United States. And for example, at the federal level and in many provincial procurements, we see terms and conditions dealing with liability that are a bit surprising, and the exposure that bidders may have to liability, both for their own actions and for actions caused by anyone under their supervision. We also see confusion over terms relating to intellectual property rights, exclusion of liability. More and more, we're seeing procurement processes in Canada where governments are trying to avoid any compensation consequences for wrongdoing during a procurement process. And all of these terms and conditions really suggest that suppliers need to get good advisors to help them navigate these terms and conditions so you know exactly what you're getting into.
Yep, great advice. Okay, so I think with that then, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry.
Thanks, Liz. And what an interesting tour of Canada you did. It's always fun to see the different parts of Canada and how they're going about their spending. And just to pick up on a point about the value of Canadian procurement conducted by public authorities, it's estimated to be about $150 billion in spending on an annual basis. And you take into account the federal spending that Liz indicated and the provincial spending that where she was able to get data on that. But as you can see, there's a very, very significant spend by sub-provincial entities like municipalities, school boards, universities, and healthcare providers. So it's a lucrative market, that's for sure. Should we go to the next slide, Liz? Thank you. So my job today is to discuss some of the legal implications of contracting or wanting to contract in Canada, and to kind of set the stage. The first issue that I'm going to be discussing is just the governance structure of procurement processes in Canada and the various legal documents that create this framework for fair and open procurements. And so we'll talk briefly about legislation, about trade treaties, government purchasing policies, decisions made by courts and the International Trade Tribunal. And then there's a final point to this, which I'll be talking about, and that is the terms and conditions of the procurement process itself. All of these items must be understood by suppliers when bidding on Canadian procurement opportunities. And I would just say it's important to keep in mind, in addition to the confusion between the different jurisdictions, Canada has, at the federal level, the federal government is responsible for a variety of particular aspects of our economy, including international trade, international relations, and defense, whereas provinces have the exclusive authority to make laws in relation to provincial or territorial commercial activities, healthcare, or the providing of healthcare, schools and universities. So you have to understand this bifurcation of our jurisdiction in Canada, because it really does get super confusing when you're trying to figure out what laws actually apply. So if we go to the next slide, Liz. So the first stop we're going to make, and this is just a very quick stop, it's to talk about legislation, acts, regulations, and bylaws. And as I said, there's a myriad of these legal documents and enactments which may apply to a particular procurement, whether conducted by the federal government or provincial governments or municipal governments. And so, for example, at the federal level, we have the government contracting regulations. We have the Canadian International Trade Tribunal Act and regulations. At provincial levels, we have public procurement acts in Nova Scotia. We have the broader Public Sector Accountability Act in Ontario. And at the local level, we have the City of Ottawa purchasing bylaws and the City of Toronto Municipal Code purchasing chapter. So all of these are just these are just examples of the variety of legislative enactments that may affect the procurement process you're interested in getting involved in. So if we can go to the next slide. And just it's important to keep in mind that the legislative framework will give suppliers an indication of the requirements and obligations that public purchasing officials are required to adhere to. Some of the legislative enactments are more detailed than others. Some just say, you know, the objective of the purchasing officials are to get best value and ensure best solutions. Whereas in other cases, the legislation will be very detailed about things the government purchasing officials can and cannot do. So having some appreciation, once again, of the framework within the legislative framework is very useful for suppliers, whether they're Canadian suppliers or European suppliers. So why don't we jump to the next slide to talk about a very uniquely Canadian phenomenon, and that is the implication of trade agreements. Canada is a trading country, and as a result, we've entered into a wide variety of trade agreements. Some of the trade agreements, and the trade agreements are all designed to reduce barriers to trade, to ensure non-discrimination, to open up opportunities to Canadian suppliers with our treaty partners and for foreign suppliers with Canada. Some provinces have entered into trade agreements as between themselves in order to bring down internal barriers to trade, which continue to plague, which in my view, continue to be a curse on the Canadian economy. Most of the trade agreements will have procurement chapters, and these impose, generally speaking, pretty much the same obligations, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I'll just give you a small sampling of the number of the different kinds of trade agreements. First of all, we have some trade agreements which only apply to the federal government's purchasing behavior, and an example of that would be the Canada-Peru Free Trade Agreement. Some trade agreements apply to federal and provincial procurement activities, and an example of that would be the World Trade Organization Agreement on Government Procurement. Some trade agreements will impose obligations at the federal, provincial, and local level, such as the CETA, what we're talking about and focusing on today. And then there are some some trade agreements which are just interprovincial, such as the New West Partnership Agreement between 4 of Canada's Western provinces. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about the common provisions of trade agreements and why these matter to European suppliers, such as those participating in this call today. And these are obligations that the procuring authorities are required to adhere to when conducting procurements. So for example, and none of these should be a big surprise to anyone here, But procuring authorities that are covered by trade agreements are required to set out technical specifications in terms of performance or functional requirements, rather than design or descriptive characteristics. In other words, you can't design a procurement to unduly favor one bidder over another, unless there is some legitimate operational need for doing that. Open competitions, in other words, competitions which will be open to suppliers from all of the trading partners, is the rule. In other words, sole source or direct contract awards are supposed to be the exception, and they're only supposed to be done in the very narrow, limited circumstances permitted by the trade agreements. There is, you've got to give enough time for bidders to submit a bid, and that is explicitly set out in trade agreements like the CETA. And then the trade agreements also provide that there should be an effective bid challenge mechanism. And that is something that sort of differs between jurisdictions, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So Liz, if we could go to the next slide. There are a number of purchasing policies that the federal and provincial governments and municipal governments as well have developed, which provide pretty solid advice to bidders about how a procurement process should be conducted. I wouldn't say that suppliers need to have a deep knowledge of these, but be sure to have an advisor who has an appreciation of what these purchasing policies require, and because they can give you some insight into the opportunities and the obligations that you're signing on to. So we'll go to the next slide. One of the next features of, and this will come as no surprise as well, there are a number of court decisions which have interpreted the obligations on a procuring authority. And in Canada, there is this one epic historic case which has for the last 40 years really defined how procurement processes are defined and interpreted. And that's a case called Ron Engineering. And in that case, Ron Engineering submitted a bid. It made a mistake in the price that it submitted, and it wanted to withdraw its bid after it was told that its price was the lowest, and that was because of its mistake. And it wanted to withdraw its bid after it was told it was the winning bidder. And the procuring authority would not allow it to withdraw its bid. And so the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court developed this matrix for interpreting procurements and the obligations that flow from them. And it developed the contract A, contract B paradigm. And essentially what that says is contract A is formed when a contractor submits a compliant bid in response to a tender, and contract B is the formal contract that governs the legal obligations when the contract is ultimately awarded. And so what this means in effect is that when you submit a compliant bid in response to a procurement, your obligations are locked in at that time, and the obligations of the procuring authority are locked in at that time. So when you bid, you've got to be prepared to deliver on what you've committed to in your procurement. I'm sorry, in your bid. Liz, I know I'm skipping quickly through my issues, and there may be questions.
Yes, so let me read out loud maybe one or two. We have a question from Gintari, who's asking, do you have any statistics showing how successful EU companies are at winning the tenders in Canada?
Oh boy. Short answer is no, I'm sorry. I don't have that answer. But I know that European companies do win their fair share of procurement opportunities in Canada. Keep in mind that Canada generally keeps open to suppliers from around the world the procurement opportunities, because sadly, our manufacturing sector has really been depleted over the last 30, 40 years. And so we're often needing to look to foreign suppliers in order to provide goods at best value and the best solution.
Thank you, Jerry. Liz, you're the person who's keeping track of time. So do you want to take a second question? There starts to be more, so I don't think we'll have the time to take them all just right now, but Want to take the second one?
What I'd like to do maybe is if we could just move on with the presentation. We'll hang on to these questions though, and absolutely when we get to our breakout rooms, if we didn't get to them yet, we'll address them then, just to gain the interest of time.
Okay, let's do that.
Thank you. So let's move on then, Liz, and I'm just going to skip over and just raise a couple of key points on the next slides that I'm responsible for. And as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of the trade agreements is one of the purposes of the trade agreements is to avoid giving a preference to domestic bidders over foreign suppliers with whom we have these trade agreements. And this is important because governments, as you can imagine, and you only have to look at the United States and its Buy American laws, but governments are often pressured to award government contracts to domestic bidders in order to stimulate domestic economic activity. But when you enter into a trade agreement, a lot of those domestic preferences have to be rejected. And so trade agreements serve an important role in keeping procurement processes open to foreign suppliers, which once again means we get better solutions, better products, and better prices. So if we can skip over the next slide, and let's go to the next slide, please. And we're going to have a look at the CETA. And I've got to say that the CETA was a very important development from the perspective of trade agreements in Canada. Your negotiators did a magnificent job in getting the government of Canada to open up procurements right down to the sub-provincial levels. And this is something that our trading partners have been after for decades and not been successful. There are some trade agreements which will apply to provincial level procurements, but at the sub-provincial level where so much spending is done with schools, municipalities, universities, healthcare providers, the CETA was able to, the CETA opened up these opportunities to European suppliers. And I am, the European Union has done a wonderful job in helping suppliers understand what opportunities may arise in Canada. And it's my understanding that in September this year, there will be an online tool that, available to European suppliers, which will allow them to know when they've identified a particular procurement opportunity they're interested in, whether the CETA would in fact apply to that. So let's skip over to the next slide. And I don't propose to really talk about this, but this is just something to keep in mind. There are financial thresholds in the CETA at which the procurement obligations are engaged. And so you need to have a look at those procurement thresholds to know whether the procurement you're bidding on would be covered by the CETA or not. There's another thing you can do if you're curious about whether the CETA applies, and that's just have a look at the procurement, the notice of proposed procurement issued by whatever government is procuring the goods and services, because they'll often say which trade agreements do apply. They're not necessarily the most accurate when they say which trade agreements do or don't apply, but it's often an indication that that will help you understand whether the trade agreements do in fact apply. Can we go to the next slide, please, Liz? This is something that's very important for European suppliers to understand, and that is, like in all trade agreements, there are a variety of exemptions and exclusions which carve out various purchases that governments may want to make. And so in Canada, for example, under the CETA, not much defense, Department of National Defense procurements are covered by the CETA. Some of the very large procurements, such as shipbuilding or aircraft or equipment required for the Army or Navy, these would not be covered by the CETA. And so you have to look at the schedules to the CETA in order to understand which procurements are covered and which procurements are not. And I'll just give you one other, and this would go as well for provincial procurements. In the CETA, you will find a variety of schedules which set out a number of different exemptions and exclusions, and you really do need to get an advisor to help you understand whether an exemption applies, because if it does, and your procurement and the contract or the procurement isn't covered by the CETA, then you won't be able to look to the CETA's obligations to protect you. And then I think that's a quick run through. Questions?
Yes, so again, so we have a lot of open questions. Liz, do you want to take one? Or Liz and Jared, do you want to take one now, or you want to?
I'll leave that to Liz. You're the boss.
So I just recommend, there's some questions coming up about, what happens if a government fails to comply. If you could hold those ones, because we're going to be covering that shortly. We have one about specific norms linked to Canada. So Europe applies EN-ISO and America has its own. Do we have a certification institute? And my thinking on that is that there are certifications, but it is very specific to an industry or to goods. There's nothing that I can say globally applies. Jerry, you might have more info on that.
Yeah, no, you're right, Liz. There are a variety of standard setting organizations that Canadian governments will make reference to in their procurements. I don't think it's just one. So you would need to have a look at whatever the procurement, the terms of the procurement require in terms of standard setting organizations or compliance.
Yeah. And I'll take just one more, and then we'll move on. And this one, we have a question about the WTO rules apply, but does your government have specific demands to responsible buying as well on the field of environment as social? So I think what we're talking here is the solicitations that include environmental considerations, social considerations, etc. I can tell you that that is something that for example, the government of BC has certainly been looking at. It's been encouraging, but at the end of the day, it is up to the buying entity to decide whether or not they want to include anything like that. We have had solicitations where they have been included. There's been, for example, in construction, over a certain dollar threshold, there's a need to hire apprentices, for example. Jerry, do you have maybe more to speak to in terms of these social environmental elements?
They're very much a part of federal government procurement these days, Liz. And if suppliers go onto the Canada Buys, the buy and sell website that houses a lot of the federal government procurement information, you'll see information relating to environmental, what they call green procurement processes that they are trying to promote.
And I'll just do one last quick one, and then we'll jump into this. We have a question here that we see that a lot of the projects or opportunities that where the Canadian Free Trade Agreement applies. The question is, because the CFTA is not, it's internal to Canada, is CETA still valid if the CFTA applies? And my understanding is it all depends on dollar thresholds. The CETA thresholds are higher than the Canada Free Trade Agreement thresholds, but it is possible that both could apply to a specific solicitation.
That's right. You could have a variety of different trade agreements that apply to a particular solicitation, but you really do have to look at the schedules to see whether there are exclusions. So, for example, in a major defense procurement, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement may apply, but the CETA would likely not apply because so much of defense spending is not covered by the CETA's obligations.
Excellent. Okay, so unfortunately, we'll have to hold questions for a moment. We're running a bit behind, so we can move on to the next part of our presentation. And I'm going to quickly take you through the various types of opportunities that you may see posted for Canadian governments. I do have a caveat with this, though. I'm going to be calling these things by specific names that I know the government of BC uses, and I've seen other jurisdictions use, but each jurisdiction may have its own naming convention. So there may be examples where I'm calling it one thing, but another jurisdiction is calling it something else. It's a matter of looking at the elements to see if it's what exactly is this. So we're going to start with notices of market sounding. So these are things that get posted that are not intended to result in a contract. So for example, a notice to vendors would be telling the vendors who might be interested in this opportunity something about it. Maybe it's upcoming plans, maybe there's a meeting happening about it, etc. So it's just giving information to vendors about something that may be of interest to them. A notice of intent or a notice to contract. This is when a public sector entity intends to do a direct award. So they're going to enter into a contract without competition, but they need to, and they're doing it because they only know of one vendor who is capable and interested in delivering what they need. And they're just checking to see if there's any other vendors who might be interested. And typically a notice of intent or a notice to contract will include the ability for another vendor to challenge that intent to award. And that just means when you challenge, you're simply saying, hey, I would be interested in bidding on this. You're just simply letting the government buyer know that. There's also expressions of interest or requests for information. So a notice of expression of interest or request for expression of interest, a government will use this when they just want to know, is there anybody out there who would bid on this if we were to put something up on if we were to release a solicitation for it. This is used either because the buying entity doesn't know of any vendors who might be interested, or they're worried that there are a ton who would be interested. And if they get 200 vendors responding to this, then it really does they need to think about their strategy as to how they're going to manage the solicitation so that they are not trying to evaluate 200 submissions for a single contract. So that's simply, if you see an expression of interest, is simply all you'd have to do is just respond and say, yes, we would be interested. You would give some contact information, you would maybe say a little bit of blurb about your company, and that's all that this is looking for. They're just seeing who would be interested. A request for information is used when the government wants to buy something, but they don't have all the information they need about what might be available in the marketplace to meet their need. They might want information to help them develop a budget that would be suitable for what they're trying to buy. This is particularly useful in those industries that are rapidly changing. At the end of the day, the vendors are the experts, not the buyers. So request for information is an opportunity for the vendors to let the buyer know what is out there that might work for what they're trying to achieve. It's an opportunity for you to influence or provide information so that the buyer can then make their decision on what they might buy. Now, keep in mind that there's no guarantee that a solicitation would actually be issued after an expression of interest or a request for information has been issued. That's typically the intent, but there's not a guarantee that that would happen. Now, when we get to actual solicitations, this is where the government has actually issued something with the intent to buy goods, services, or construction. They basically come in two buckets of types of solicitations, and I'm sure this is not terribly different from what you would experience in your own countries, starting with those that are price-based. Typically, these are called invitations to quote or requests for quote or invitations to tender. Basically, it means that the lowest price that meets all the mandatory requirements and specifications, that is the vendor who gets awarded the contract for price-based. So price is the only deciding factor once it's been determined that, yes, they are actually giving us a price on the specifications that we've put out there and all the mandatories are met. Scored solicitations, these are the ones where price is often a factor, but it is not the sole factor in determining who is successful. Often these solicitations would include things like a description of how you would deliver, a description of your experience or capabilities that show you can do it, as well as price. These are typical names that you might see these scored opportunities called. Requests for proposals are very, very common. Requests for qualifications would result in a list, so it's some sort of pre-qualification process, and that list might be used just once, or it might be a multi-use list that's used over and over again when there's a frequent need. A request for a standing offer or some sort of supply arrangement, so this is where we run this solicitation. We have our one or more vendors where we have these arrangements with. There's no contract though until an order is placed. So think, for example, any services related to fighting wildfires is a really good example. example. We know we're going to need them. We don't know where, we don't know how much. We'll put these supply arrangements in place. And when the fires happen, that's when we contact these vendors and get the services or the goods we need from them. And then there's also negotiated or non-binding processes, requests for proposals. And this goes to what Jerry was speaking about earlier in terms of the court case that happened a long time ago, where we had that contract, the two contracts that result, contract A around the solicitation process, and then the performance contract, the contract B that we typically think of as the contract. There are some processes happening now that are opting out of that. And these are typically called a negotiated or a non-binding process. So you are going to have terms and conditions in all of these opportunities that are resulting in a contract. So this would not apply to the market sounding and notices, but anything where we're intending to buy something, there's going to be terms and conditions. And they're going to have two sets of them. One set is going to be specific to the solicitation itself. So it's basically the rules that apply if you are going to participate in this solicitation. Then there's also the terms and conditions for the contract. So it's very typical in Canada that you will have a solicitation that will include either a contract format or select contract terms. And the solicitation will either say that, you know, something like if you're successful, you're going to enter into a contract with substantially the same as these terms and conditions. There's not a lot of wiggle room unless you're in a negotiated or non-binding process, not a lot of wiggle room with that. So it's important that you know what these terms and conditions are, that you you have a read of them so you know what the rules are for the solicitation, but also in the contract, because if there's something in there that you simply could not agree to, you could not sign a contract that had that clause in there, while the solicitation is open, you can ask questions to get that changed, but you would not necessarily be able to do that after it closes. And now if you're the winning bidder, having those changes happen then is going to be very problematic. Yeah. So with that, I'm just going to jump past this to questions on here. Maybe we can take one more before we move on to the next piece of this.
Oh yeah, go ahead if you have them in front of you.
Yes, I do. And we've got a question here: which domains cover public procurements in Canada? Everything, including services, subcontracting, temporary personnel hiring, etc. So in terms of public procurement in Canada, the various governments, they can buy, and they do buy, virtually anything: goods, services, construction. I mean, if you can think of it, there is likely a public sector entity buying that. And, you know, good example, mattresses. So you'd think, okay, what would the public sector need with mattresses? Well, think about things like correctional institutions and hospitals, and, you know, that is absolutely a need that they would have. So it's something that government would buy. In terms of services, sure, temporary personnel hiring, absolutely. We actually have an arrangement in BC that is exactly that. So we need someone in on a temporary basis to do administrative work. They've worked out with the unions and such so that we can actually do that hiring through a contract. So it's virtually everything. And then we have a question about the success or lack of success of EU SME's history in Canada, which was at the heart of the EU CETA commitment. I'll just do a quick one on this, and then Jerry, you might have something to add to this. My experience in Canadian procurement is that a lot of jurisdictions are just now starting to track or getting some business intelligence information and tracking what did they buy, where are they buying it, who are their vendors and such. I don't think there's a lot of information available at this point in time, but I do see that changing in the future. And Jerry, maybe you have something to add to that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Liz. And at best, there's anecdotal evidence we get from European suppliers who tell us whether or not they're successful, even at the small and medium enterprise stage. So there is a complete lack of any kind of useful data to tell us whether or not there is measurable success or not at this point.
Yeah. Okay, so perhaps we should move on then, just to, because we're certainly going over time and I know folks want to get into our breakout. So, and this next topic I think is something that a number of folks have expressed in the questions that I've seen that they're curious about. So let's get into the unfair procurement practices and what is it you can do if you feel like this has happened and it has been detrimental to your participation in a solicitation. So I'm going to start with a little bit of what the examples are. So we'll talk about specifications. So sometimes it might seem that the specifications or the requirements in a solicitation are written so that only one vendor could possibly be successful, or only a Canadian vendor could possibly be successful. And examples of this might be we're buying goods and there's a specific make and model that is stated, and they don't want any substitution. So if you don't sell that make and model, you're out of luck with it. Or maybe there's a methodology that they want to use, but the intellectual property is owned by one particular vendor. If you see something like this, it's certainly possible that what you think is going on is what's going on, that they are trying to limit competition, but there's also potential that there's a business reason why this limitation is there. So for example, a particular make and model of a product might be needed because it's a compatibility issue, or for example, maybe it's supplies that are being used and the staff that use them are used to a particular way that things work, and to switch and have to retrain and such would be problematic. So when you're looking at something that the requirements or specifications seem very tight or unfair, think about the business reasons behind it, and certainly feel free to ask those questions. Another big problem is insufficient time to bid. That's where the solicitation is posted and then it's closing in such a short time that it makes it very difficult for a vendor to read what's required, to figure out what's being asked for, to do the research they need to do, to put their submission together and still make that deadline. That there is guidance, and certainly the trade agreements have some minimum time frames associated to it. So if you see something that you think is too short, there's nothing wrong with asking that question to have it extended. But keep in mind two things. One is that you need to be looking at how long the solicitation was posted from the beginning, not from when you actually saw it. So if it was posted for 2 weeks before you saw it, then think about it from the time it was actually posted till it closes. Is that a reasonable period of time? And if you are going to ask for an extension, don't make it personal to just your organization. It's very difficult for a buying entity to say, I'm going to extend the closing date when there's only one vendor who's really going to benefit from that. So try and think of a reason why multiple vendors, more than just you, would benefit from having an extension to the closing time. Mandatory requirements. Every solicitation has to describe how the award is going to be made, and that starts with the mandatory requirements. These are things that you must meet at the time of closing in order for your submission to be considered. So it's very important that you know what the mandatory requirements are and you know how it is that you will meet each one. And by all means, if they don't make sense, feel free to ask questions, etc., to get the clarity that you need so you know how to meet them. And another issue that can happen is something changes after closing. So for something in the process, let's say, for example, we did a request for proposal. We had the two top scoring vendors are very, very close. And now the buyer decides, well, we should probably add a shortlist process like an interview so that we can really differentiate between these two vendors. If that interview was not part of the description of how the award was going to be made, that should not be added after closing. That's something that is now the buyer is deviating from the process they said they would use. And unless they're in some sort of negotiated or non-binding process, they're actually obligated to award the way they said that they would. Another thing that comes up is the wrong vendor gets selected, and then this can be a perception that people have. You know, you see who won the solicitation and you think, I know that vendor, they're not going to meet the requirements. I know what the requirements are. I know that vendor, they couldn't possibly meet it. Or they don't have the experience. I know that vendor and I saw how much experience was expected. They simply don't have it. Or that their price is going to be higher. So if you see yourself in this position, remember that the buyer is obligated to award the contract the way they said they would in the solicitation. So you might have a perception that the winning vendor doesn't meet the requirements, but because of that obligation to make sure that they award the way they said they would, you don't know what was in their submission. So maybe they had a way of meeting all of those requirements. Maybe in the experience, they lost points there because you're more experienced than them. Perhaps you scored higher and they didn't, but overall, they still overall scored higher than you did. In terms of price, remember that a scored solicitation price is only one of the criteria. It's quite possible that the winner will be a higher price than what you may have offered. If it's a price-based solicitation and your price was lower, you really want to find out what specification or mandatory requirement did I not meet. There are some informal remedies that you can do if you're in this situation. Something's happened that you think was unfair. First thing I would recommend is that you do your research. Find out what was the process supposed to look like. So the buying jurisdiction may have a website that explains what their process is. You want to have a read of that and see, okay, do you see anything that deviated from this? Some jurisdictions have a lot of information, some don't have any. So if you're in a situation where they don't have any, I put up here BC Bid Resources. It's guidance documents or guidance information that the BC government has put together for buyers and for vendors that have a lot of the same principles would apply to other jurisdictions. Dollar values might change, etc., but the principles are going to be fairly similar. So if you can't find it from the buying entity, which you should go to first, BC Bid Resources is another place that you can look. If you have participated in a solicitation and you were not successful, or even if you are successful, ask for a debrief meeting. So these are private meetings between you and the buyer where you can get the details on the strengths and weaknesses of your submission. On a scored solicitation, and that's really good information to have to know where are you doing well and what should you be improving, what were they really looking for. So debrief meetings, I recommend that you use those as a learning tool. Another informal remedy, if you really think they've gone offside with things, is that you can write to the elected official for this jurisdiction. So we're talking the minister if you're speaking about federal solicitation, provincial or territorial. If it's at a local government level, you'd be writing to the mayor. These letters are taken very seriously, and they will be they will be addressed. So that's another option that you have. And I think I'm going to quickly just go over turn this over to Jerry, who's going to talk about the more formal recourses that are available to you.
Thank you, Liz. And I am only going to briefly touch on these because of in the interest of time. Why don't we go to the next slide, Liz? Thank you. And so what is the recourse if you feel that a procurement process has been conducted unfairly? And this is where you really do need to ensure that you get good advice, because I have seen more cases than I would like where bidders feel unfairly treated, but they don't really know what course to pursue or where to go to seek a remedy. And why this is important in having this understanding, as you get into the bidding process, you should really think about getting an advisor who can help you navigate some of these issues, because you really do have to act quickly. Let me give you an example. At the federal level, if a procurement is covered by a trade agreement, such as the CETA, and you feel that there has been some unfairness, then you may have the ability or the right to challenge that unfair practice at the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. But in order to file your complaint, to make your grievance known, you have to start the process within 10 working days. And so that doesn't give you much time to formulate your complaint and to file it with the CITT. And it's also important to keep in mind that you have to file your complaint with the CITT or file an objection with the procuring authority within 10 working days of knowing of learning about the unfairness. And so, as Liz pointed out a few moments ago, you may see a procurement process which has what you think are unfair technical specifications. It seems that the technical specifications are designed to favor one competitor or one supplier over another. Well, at the federal level, if it's covered by one of the trade agreements, you have to initiate the bid challenge process within 10 working days of that RFP or that procurement process being issued. You cannot wait until the bids are submitted and evaluated to raise some of the issues that you may think are unfair. Obviously, you will want to wait until the bids are evaluated to see how you scored before you launch any challenges against, say, the winning bidder. But timeframes are absolutely critical, particularly at the federal level, and particularly for those cases where the CITT has jurisdiction. There are, if the CITT doesn't have jurisdiction regarding a federal procurement, there may be recourse at the Federal Court of Canada or the Provincial Superior Courts. These will typically only look at whether, or those courts will typically only look at whether the procuring authority followed the terms of the RFP, or whether they committed some public law fault that requires the procurement to be remanded or remitted back to the procuring authority to correct and do again. And knowing where to go to seek your remedy it really requires that you get good advice. I've just finished dealing with a case with a European supplier who failed to launch their complaint within a timely way, and they were then prevented from doing that by the CITT, who said that they filed their complaint too late. And so even where the complaint may have legitimacy, you may get timed out. If you go to the courts and if you seek a remedy either in Provincial Superior Court or at the Federal Court, you may be able to claim damages if the RFP wasn't followed as it was written. Or, as I said, if you, in some cases, you can ask the court to send the procurement back to the procuring authority if you feel that there has been some procedural unfairness or some unequal treatment between bidders. But once again, it's important that you get legal advice to help you know where your appropriate bid challenge authority is. And I think, Liz, I'm going to leave it at that because I know we've got some questions that will touch on these issues. And given the timing now, my preference would be to deal with these either now or in the breakout room.
Excellent, thank you. All righty, so and that's a great question. Do we want to take the questions on that we have here, or do we want to go to the breakout sessions and deal with them there? So Antoine, do you want to?
Yes, I think that given that we're already quite a bit behind, maybe if it's okay with you, of course, we can move to the breakout session.
That would totally work for us. And Jerry, do you want to have a little bit of a blurb about what you're going to speak to, and I'll do the same for what I'm going to speak to, and then folks can decide where they want to go.
Sure, thanks, Liz. And just as a reminder to the audience, we will be circulating, or at least Antoine will be circulating on our behalf, the slides that we have gone through, and there will be notes attached to them that give more information. They flesh out the content of the slides so you get a bit more understanding of what it is we were speaking about, and maybe some direction where you can go for additional information. It is my intention in my breakout room to deal with any questions of a legal nature that folks may have. Happy to answer those, as Liz said. I'm not giving legal advice, but I'm happy to tackle what questions you may ask. And so I'll deal with the legal issues and bid recourse, of course, as well.
Excellent. And for myself, I'll be dealing with the more practical sides of things. So the how do you find opportunities, what you should be looking for when you find one of interest, that end of things. That's what my breakout room will be dealing with.
Excellent. So as you can see, I have added in the chat the links to the 2 breakout meetings. So we will open those meeting rooms now. So if you want to connect with Liz, you have the link. This is the second link. If you want to connect with Jerry, this is the first link. And Jerry and Liz, of course, I will ask you to join your own meeting rooms as well in just a minute using the same links. And this is a meeting format, so you'll be able to actually speak directly. Just make sure that you remain muted when you are not speaking for the sake of the group discussion. I will leave this webinar open just for a few more minutes to just give everyone time to join their meeting rooms. Once you've chosen one of the two, you'll have to stick with this one, right? There's no way of coming back to the webinar and going to the other room. So just choose according to your main interest. And we will also send the slides afterwards. We have a couple of questions that have been addressed in written form that we couldn't address. Maybe we will also like share some answers with you afterwards. I'll try and connect with the speakers to arrange for this. So I thank you very much for your presence in this webinar. I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conversation, and I certainly hope that this has been proven useful to you. Have a great rest of the day and enjoy the breakout sessions.
Okay. All right.